Do you always work this late? Clara Whitmore asked, her voice carrying across the empty porch, the sound almost swallowed by the wind rustling the dry grass. She did not wait for an answer. The horses whinnied softly in their pens, a reminder that even in the stillness, the work never stopped. Her hands rested on the rough wood of the gate, worn smooth from years of opening and closing, each groove a memory of mornings spent tending the small patch of land she called her own. She stepped back, brushing a streak of dust from her apron, and watched the fence line that separated her farm from the neighboring ranch. Across it, the last slant of sunlight caught the roof of the Walker barn, and she imagined a man moving inside, tools in hand, moving quietly through the familiar rhythm of labor. A breeze lifted her hair as she bent to gather a basket of freshly picked potatoes, arranging them neatly on the stoop. Each one was a small weight, grounding her in the ordinary, but as she straightened, she caught sight of footprints near the edge of the fence, fresh, deliberate, and leading away toward the barn. Clara's pulse quickened without a sound, her fingers curling around the basket handle. She did not cross the line. She waited, noticing how the board on the gate had warped just slightly, how the hinges groaned under the last rain. She set the basket down and ran her hand along the weathered wood, tracing the marks made by seasons past, imagining hands like hers, or perhaps stronger, steadier ones, sliding over the same surface. A shadow moved near the barn, fleeting, indistinct, but enough to make her glance again, catching the glint of a lantern's flame reflected on the dusty ground. The evening chill crept along her arms, and she pulled her shawl tighter. Inside the house, the kettle hissed softly, steam curling from the spout as she poured water into a small pot, her movements precise and unhurried. She measured flour, arranging a few small loaves on the counter, their warmth spreading through the room. The smell of bread, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her boots, the muted call of a rooster in the distance. Each detail anchored her in the life she had built alone. Still, her eyes drifted back to the fence, to the quiet land beyond, sensing a presence she had yet to meet directly, a man whose work spoke before his voice ever would. Clara straightened, the evening settling around her like a blanket, and took one last glance at the line that divided her world from the unknown, feeling the first flicker of anticipation, a subtle shift in the rhythm of her day, as if the land itself had whispered that the ordinary might soon stretch into something more. Clara stepped onto the worn porch, the morning chill tugging at the edges of her shawl as she adjusted the basket of eggs in her arms. Across the fence, she saw him moving methodically among the horses, boots sinking into the soft earth, hands steady as he checked the bridles and reins. She paused, noticing the precision in each motion, the care with which he lifted the hay and set it down without disturbing a single strand. The sun caught the edge of his hat, casting a shadow over the barn wall, and Clara's gaze lingered longer than usual. She shifted the basket, listening to the soft scrape of a hoof, the faint clatter of a bucket, small sounds that marked his presence without words. Day after day, the rhythm repeated. He repaired the broken post on her fence, adjusted the latch that had squeaked too long, and left a small bundle of feed beside it. Each gesture was quiet, unassuming, yet it made her notice the spaces she had ignored before, the empty chair at the table, the unlit hearth, the silence that filled the corners of her cabin. She began rising earlier, timing her chores to coincide with his routine, watching the way he moved through the land with a practiced ease, as if the territory itself acknowledged him. When the morning mist settled low, he appeared at the gate, carrying a bundle of firewood with even breaths, setting it down just beyond the fence. She felt the subtle weight of his action, the offer of effort without demand. Clara adjusted her apron, bending to sweep a patch of the porch, and she caught the faint smell of coffee carried on the breeze, already poured into a tin cup beside the gate. She did not move to drink it immediately, instead letting her eyes trace the straight line of the fence, noticing the subtle bend in a rail he had repaired days before, imagining the patience it had taken to make it right. A faint warmth stirred inside her, small and cautious, as though the land itself was whispering that these repeated acts could mean something beyond work, a connection forming quietly, one careful gesture at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fence, and a sudden movement drew Clara's gaze. A calf had slipped through a loose board near the gate, hooves scrambling against the soft earth, the rope tangled awkwardly around its legs. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped onto her side of the land, boots sinking slightly in the damp soil, hands steady as he knelt to untangle the animal. Clara held her breath, watching the careful precision of each motion, the way his fingers worked through the rope without force, the calf calming gradually under his touch. He lifted it just enough to free its legs and set it down gently on the other side, brushing mud from its coat with the sleeve of his shirt. Clara's eyes followed him as he adjusted the gate, nailing the board securely with movements practiced and unhurried, the hammer striking wood with quiet authority. She noticed the small bundle of oats he left beside the calf, a subtle gesture, and felt a stir of something she had not expected, a flicker of anticipation she could not name. The wind carried faint scents of leather and hay, and Clara adjusted her shawl, the warmth of the sun touching her face, yet she kept her eyes on him. He glanced at her once, slight and unassuming, then returned to the barn, the rhythm of his work uninterrupted, yet marked by care. Every day repeated in these small acts. The gate fixed, the firewood stacked, a pail of water left where she would find it. Clara began to notice patterns. The way he always arrived before the sun touched the roofline. How his movements never wasted energy. How the land seemed to respond to his presence. The way the fence no longer felt like a boundary, but a line that could be crossed. She moved closer to her chores, pausing at intervals to observe him, feeling the quiet shift of the land and the subtle pull of his constancy, realizing that each repeated gesture, each unnoticed kindness, was stitching a connection she had not yet dared to name. Clara carried a tin of warm broth to the edge of the fence, balancing it carefully as the ground beneath her boots sagged slightly from the morning dew. She set it down just beyond the gate and stepped back, brushing her hands on the apron at her waist, noticing how the light caught the rough grain of the wood. Across the fence, Ethan adjusted a loose strap on one of the saddles, his movements deliberate and steady, pausing to brush a strand of hay from the leather. He glanced toward the tin and, without speaking, nodded once, a small acknowledgement of her effort, then continued his work. The fence no longer felt like a line of separation but a meeting place, a space where actions could speak. Clara bent to tie the basket of eggs more securely, feeling the rhythm of the day settle into her bones, each repetition of ordinary labor connecting them quietly. Later, she noticed that a plank on the gate had been replaced, cut to fit with precision, the nail set flush so it would not catch her hands when lifted. She paused to run her fingers along it, appreciating the care taken, the subtle kindness embedded in every motion. She gathered the milk pails from the barn, arranging them neatly in the wash trough, and caught sight of him moving down the fence line, carrying a bundle of firewood, setting it gently on the ground so it would be ready for her. Clara's chest lifted slightly at the small predictability of his visits, the assurance of presence in actions rather than words. The gate remained central, the symbol of connection and shared space, quietly evolving as each day passed. The sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the land, illuminating the small, repeated gestures that stitched their routines together. Each measured step, each bundle placed with care, and each adjustment to the land or the fence became a language of its own. Clara stood for a moment, observing, realizing that the space between them had begun to feel less like distance and more like possibility, a gentle invitation shaped by consistent, tangible effort. The rhythm of the morning continued, steady, familiar, and comforting, hinting that the quiet trust building here would soon reach a tipping point, though neither spoke of it yet. Clara arranged the fresh eggs in the basket, carefully setting each one to rest in its place, and noticed the way the light caught the worn edges of the fence where Ethan had repaired the boards. She carried them across the yard to the small kitchen, placing the basket on the counter beside the tin cup of coffee he had left there earlier. The smell of the coffee mingled with the earthy scent of the morning, filling the room with quiet warmth. Outside, the wind rustled the hay, and she caught a glimpse of him bending over the trough, adjusting the water so that the horses drank without spilling onto the ground. She stepped to the window, observing him move from animal to animal, hands steady, gaze attentive, noting how every gesture was measured in kind. Feeling a small weight of responsibility, She took the broom and swept the porch, aligning the boards and brushing away stray dust, the rhythm familiar and grounding. A bundle of firewood appeared at the gate, neatly stacked, the end of the stick protruding slightly, as if placed just for her notice. Clara adjusted the basket on her arm and walked to the gate, acknowledging the gift by straightening the top board, lining it evenly with the rest. She returned inside, setting the basket down again, and began kneading dough, fingers pressing gently, the motion habitual yet comforting. Noticing the warmth rising from the small loaf she shaped with care. Later, she carried a pail of water to the trough for the chickens, pausing to lift the gate slightly so that Ethan could bring a small cart of hay closer to her porch without spilling, the two of them exchanging no words, only gestures of cooperation. She noticed how the small acts of tending the animals, carrying supplies, and maintaining the land began to draw a subtle pattern of connection, each repeated act layering trust upon trust. Clara straightened the apron around her waist, glanced at the fence dividing the two lands, and felt the quiet pulse of belonging. The way the ordinary work, shared space, and mutual care wove them together without speech. The land, the fence, the animals, and the simple tools of daily labor all became a vocabulary of care, and she realized that this steady attention and thoughtful contribution was shaping a bond stronger than any declaration could. Each day ended with her closing the gate, pausing to feel the texture of the wood, and sensing the presence of another in the land next door, a silent assurance that connection, patience, and care were laying the foundation for something that neither of them yet named, yet both depended upon. For the first time in weeks, the gate did not sound before sunrise. Clara noticed it while she was measuring cornmeal into a bowl, her hand stopping above the sack as the kitchen settled into a silence that felt larger than the room. No hoofsteps along the fence. No low scrape of a bucket being set near the trough. No dark hat moving beyond the pasture while the first light came over the ridge. She finished the batter anyway, because chickens still needed feed and the cow still needed milking, and the stove did not care whether a woman was listening for a man on the other side of a fence. She carried the scraps to the yard and found nothing waiting by the gate except frost on the top rail. By noon, Mrs. Halbert's grandson came down the road with a flour sack tied behind his saddle, sent from town with a message that a section of cattle fence had washed out nearly 12 miles north, and Ethan Walker had ridden out before dawn to help bring in strays before weather turned. Clara took the sack from the boy, gave him 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and watched him ride away. She stood a while after that with the gate latch in her hand. Then she went to work. She patched the torn hinge on her chicken coop, hauled 2 pails of water from the well, and turned the little bean row before the ground hardened. In the afternoon, she crossed no fence, but she carried a covered pan of cornbread to the shared rail and left it on Ethan's side beneath a clean towel, weighted with a smooth stone so the wind would not take it. She did not know when he would return. That was the point of the towel. That was the point of the stone. At dusk, the Halbert boy came back the long way with his little sister riding behind him, both of them red-cheeked from the cold and leading a tired pony with a loose shoe. Clara brought them inside without fuss, set the girl near the stove, and put a cup of warm milk into her small hands. She fixed the boy's torn glove with 3 tight stitches while biscuits browned in the oven, and when the children ate at her table, their boots tucked beneath their chairs and crumbs gathering on the cloth, the cabin did not feel so hollow. The girl fell asleep with her head against the chair back. The boy watched Clara wrap the remaining biscuits for their ride home, and said Mr. Walker always tied bundles the same way, with a knot turned under so it would not catch. Clara looked down at her own hands and saw that she had done exactly that. She slept lightly that night. Near morning, before the sky had turned blue, she heard a horse stop by the fence. She opened the door with her shawl around her shoulders. Ethan stood on his side of the gate, mud on his coat, weariness in the set of his shoulders, the empty cornbread pan tucked under one arm, and the clean towel folded over it. He set both on the post between them. Then, without making a speech of it, he reached down and lifted the latch she had struggled with all week, working it twice until it moved smooth and easy beneath his hand. The storm came before supper, not with thunder at first, but with a hard wind that flattened the grass and turned the cottonwood leaves pale. Clara saw the horses lift their heads on Ethan's side of the fence, all of them facing the same direction, and she set her bread dough aside without covering it. Something was wrong. She took her lantern, pulled her shawl tight, and crossed to the gate just as Ethan came out of his barn with a coil of rope over one shoulder. He saw her there and stopped only long enough to take in her boots, her lantern, and the way she had already lifted the latch. Then he nodded once, and they moved. Hey! Young Mare had pushed through a weakened section near the creek bottom, frightened by the wind and tangled brush, and the rain had begun to turn the low ground slick. Ethan went first, steady and careful, speaking low to the animal, while Clara held the lantern high and kept the other horses from crowding the brake. When a loose board swung hard in the wind, she caught it with both hands and braced it against her hip. Mud soaked the hem of her dress. Rain ran down her sleeves. She stayed. Ethan worked the rope gently, not rushing the mare, not forcing her, waiting for each small step before asking for another. Clara shifted the lantern when he needed light, handed him a clean length of cloth from her apron pocket, and opened the gate at the right moment without being told. The mare came through at last, trembling but safe, and Ethan led her into the barn while Clara turned back to the broken fence. She could have gone home then. Her stove was warm. Her bread was rising. Her own roof waited dry and quiet across the rail. Instead, she lifted the fallen board, set the nail pouch on the post, and held the timber square until Ethan returned with the hammer. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the rain, hands moving around each other with the ease of people who had earned a rhythm through small mornings and ordinary repairs. No one gave orders. No one needed to. When the last nail went in, the fence held. Clara lowered her hands and saw they were shaking from cold, not fear. Ethan noticed. He stripped off his dry work gloves from inside his coat and placed them in her hands, then took the lantern from her so she could pull them on. She looked toward her cabin, its window dim through the rain, then toward his barn where the mare had quieted and the horses stood close together in the lamplight. She walked to the barn door and checked the latch herself, pressing it twice to be certain. Only then did she turn back. Ethan was standing by the repaired fence, watching the gate swing between their two properties. Clara stepped through it without waiting for him to open it. The rain softened. Behind her, her own cabin sat dark now, the bread forgotten on the table. Ahead, Ethan's barn held warmth, hay, tired animals, and the first place in years where her hands had been needed before her heart had been asked for anything. The morning air was crisp, and the gate between their lands stood solid, newly reinforced. Ethan appeared first, his boots crunching on the frost-lined path, carrying 2 buckets of water for the horses, steady in motion and deliberate in placement. He set one near the trough and the other against the barn wall, brushing his gloves over his coat as if to remove the last streaks of mud, then glanced toward Clara, who was sweeping the porch. Without a word, he lifted the latch on the small section of fence she had struggled with all week, holding it open for her to pass through. Clara's hands paused on the broom handle, a faint awareness settling in her chest as she stepped through, feet careful on the uneven ground, eyes on the familiar timbers that now felt shared rather than dividing. Ethan set the buckets down, adjusting one handle so it would not tilt, and in that small motion he marked his choice, not with speech, not with flourish, but with steady, thoughtful action. Clara carried a bundle of firewood across the line, placing each log atop the stack he had begun, the rhythm of their work aligning without planning, hands brushing occasionally as they passed a log, a momentary spark of connection in the ordinary labor. The sun broke through a patch of gray cloud, illuminating the fence and the gap between their lands, the shadow of the rail stretching long and solid across the frost. Ethan straightened and reached into his coat, producing a small tin of oats he had measured precisely, setting it on the ground between them for the horses. Clara adjusted the top board of the gate, aligning it neatly, and stepped back to watch him return to his barn, pausing at the door to glance toward her with an expression quiet but unmistakable. She lifted the latch fully and crossed to his side of the property, picking up the pail of water he had left, carrying it to the trough while he guided the horse's head to drink. Their movements were no longer separate routines. They were a shared cadence, a silent acknowledgement that the space between them now held trust and choice. The fence, repaired and reinforced, was no longer a boundary. It was a marker of togetherness, a subtle declaration of standing beside her, of aligning effort, of claiming space for two where once it had been for one. Clara felt a steady warmth, not in words but in the ease of shared labor, the certainty of presence, and the quiet, unspoken assurance that this land, this work, and this day belonged to them both. Clara set the last loaf of bread on the kitchen counter and turned to the window, watching as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting a warm golden glow over the fence and the shared pasture. The horses nuzzled each other near the gate, their quiet contentment mirroring her own sense of calm. She carried a small tin of feed and placed it at the corner where the fence met the barn, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she did so, careful to line the tin perfectly with the edge of the post. Ethan stepped from the barn just then, hands empty, sleeves rolled, the quiet way he held himself speaking more than words ever could. He glanced at the tin, nodded once, and went to the water trough, adjusting the flow so that the horses drank evenly without spilling. Clara watched him move, the rhythm of his labor steady and precise, and she realized the cabin behind her, the barn beside him, and the fence between them had become part of a whole she belonged to. She collected a basket of kindling from the porch and carried it to the hearth inside his barn, stacking it neatly so the fire would burn evenly through the night. Ethan paused mid-motion to watch her, and for the first time, Clara felt no distance, no hesitation, only the subtle reassurance that her presence mattered, that her efforts were seen and welcomed. She settled the basket, brushed her hands over her apron, and glanced around at the warm, lit space, at the horses breathing steadily in the soft glow, at the simple work done together, and felt the pulse of home thrum quietly beneath her ribs. The gate between their properties, repaired and solid, seemed to hum with the connection forged through days of small, consistent acts, the repeated kindness, the care for animals, the tending of hearth and land, the silent acknowledgement of one another. Clara straightened, taking in the view of the fence, the barn, and the small patch of her own land now intertwined with his, and with a soft exhale, she stepped closer to the hearth, settled the kindling, and watched the fire take, the warmth spreading through the barn and through her, carrying the quiet certainty that she was part of this place, part of this effort, part of something shared. Outside, the last light of day faded, but the steady glow from the hearth illuminated her hands as she smoothed the ashes, the final gesture of labor and belonging marking the moment when the land, the animals, the fence, and the man beside her became her home.